Blood marked their path through the morning mist. Not droplets, but tiny paw prints stained crimson against the fallen pine needles. Sergeant James Anderson had tracked many things in his life, but never had he followed a trail quite like this one. Two bear cubs, barely old enough to walk, were leading him deeper into the Colorado wilderness with purposeful determination. Their cries echoed through the trees, not with fear of the human behind them, but with an urgency that defied the laws of nature itself. As the younger cub turned to ensure he was still following, its eyes reflected something that would haunt James for years to come: intelligence, desperation, and something else that sent chills down his spine: hope. In that moment, he knew he wasn't tracking these cubs. They were guiding him. And what waited at the end of this blood-stained trail would forever change his understanding of the thin line between instinct and intelligence, between wild and human, between desperation and trust. The morning had started like any other at Fort Carson. James had begun his routine patrol of the training grounds at dawn, his boots moving silently through the underbrush as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy above. After 12 years as the base's wilderness survival instructor, he knew these woods better than the streets of his hometown. Every ridge, every hollow, every seasonal creek had become familiar territory. The spring air carried the sweet scent of pine and new growth, mixing with the earthy aroma of thawing soil. James checked his watch. 6:30. He had 4 more hours to scout potential locations for next week's advanced survival course. His backpack held the essentials: water, emergency medical supplies, satellite phone, and enough gear to survive 72 hours if needed. Standard protocol, though he had never needed it before. The first unusual sign came with the silence. Spring mornings in these woods usually buzzed with life: birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But as James moved deeper into the forest, an unnatural quiet fell around him. His military instincts, honed by years of service, triggered internal alarms. Something had disturbed the natural order here. He paused, listening intently. The silence broke with a sound that seemed out of place: a whimper followed by a scratching noise. Then another whimper, more urgent this time. James moved cautiously toward the source, his trained eyes scanning the surrounding trees. The sound led him to a small clearing, where the morning mist still clung to the ground in wispy tendrils. The first cub emerged from behind a fallen log, its dark fur matted and dirty. It was small, probably no more than 3 months old. Its movements were unsteady, and James immediately noticed the dried blood on its right front paw. The second cub appeared moments later, slightly smaller than its sibling, but moving with the same determined purpose. James's mind raced through his wilderness training. Bear cubs never approached humans. Their instinct, taught by their mothers from birth, was to flee from human contact. Yet these cubs moved toward him with deliberate steps, their eyes fixed on his face with an intelligence that seemed almost impossible. The larger cub stumbled, letting out a pain-filled cry as it put weight on its injured paw. Its sibling pressed close, supporting it as they continued their approach. The behavior stunned James. This wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. The cubs were not only seeking help, they were working together to reach him. He knelt slowly, maintaining what should have been a threatening posture to wild animals. The cub showed no fear. Instead, the smaller one rose briefly on its hind legs, swaying as it got a better look at him, before dropping back to all fours. Their eyes never left his face, and their cries took on a more urgent tone. Every piece of training, every wilderness guide, every survival manual warned against approaching bear cubs. Where there were cubs, a mother bear was usually close by, and few things in nature were more dangerous than a mother bear protecting her young. But as James watched these cubs, his instincts told him something was terribly wrong. The mother wasn't nearby. If she were, these cubs wouldn't be approaching a human, wouldn't be covered in dirt and blood, wouldn't be moving with such desperate purpose. The smaller cub took another step forward, then turned to look back the way they had come. It repeated this motion, clearly wanting James to follow. The behavior was so explicit, so intentional, that James felt a shiver run down his spine. In all his years in these woods, in all his military experience, he had never seen anything like this. These cubs weren't just lost or hurt. They were asking for help in a way that transcended the natural boundaries between wild and human. James took a deep breath, his military training warring with the unprecedented situation before him. The cubs continued their urgent cries, the sound piercing through the unnatural silence of the forest. His hand instinctively moved to the satellite phone in his pocket. Protocol demanded he report this. Call in wildlife services, maintain his distance. But something about the cub's behavior told him there wasn't time for protocol. The larger cub limped forward again, its injured paw leaving those small bloody prints on the forest floor. Its sibling stayed close, occasionally pressing against it for support. Their coordination spoke of intelligence that went beyond mere instinct. These weren't just animals acting on impulse. They were working together with clear purpose. This goes against everything I know, James muttered to himself, slowly rising from his crouched position. The cubs immediately responded to his movement, their cries becoming more insistent. The smaller one took several steps in the direction they had come from, then turned back to him with an almost human-like impatience. Time was clearly a factor. The blood on the larger cub's paw wasn't fresh, but the injury was serious enough to warrant concern. Both cubs showed signs of hunger and exhaustion. Whatever had happened to their mother, it had left them alone long enough for desperation to override their natural fear of humans. James made his decision. Sometimes survival meant trusting your instincts over your training. He activated the GPS tracking on his phone, marking his current location. If this went wrong, at least search and rescue would know where to start looking. Then he gestured to the cubs, a simple forward motion with his hand. The response was immediate. Both cubs turned and began moving through the underbrush, setting a pace that their small legs could manage while ensuring James followed. The smaller cub frequently looked back, checking his progress, while the injured one focused on navigating the rough terrain. They led him deeper into the forest, away from the familiar training grounds and into areas he rarely patrolled. The terrain grew rougher, with steep inclines and rocky outcrops breaking through the forest floor. Old-growth trees towered above them, their dense canopy casting strange shadows in the morning light. James noted every landmark, every turn, building a mental map of their route. The cubs' behavior grew more agitated as they progressed. Their cries took on a different tone, more urgent, more frightened. The injured cub struggled on the steeper sections, but refused to slow down. Its sibling stayed close, helping to steady it on particularly difficult stretches. Their teamwork was remarkable, defying everything James knew about wild animals. An hour into their journey, the cubs' pace quickened despite their obvious exhaustion. The smaller one's checking glances became more frequent, its eyes pleading with James to hurry. The forest had changed around them, the underbrush thinning as the ground became increasingly rocky. Old mining country, James realized. This part of Colorado was riddled with abandoned mines and equipment from the gold rush era. Signs of human activity began to appear. Rusted pieces of machinery half buried in the earth, rotting support beams from long-abandoned mining operations, steel cables snaking through the undergrowth like metallic vines. James's concern grew. This was dangerous territory, full of hidden shafts and unstable ground. No wonder the area was off limits for training exercises. The cubs led him around a particularly large outcropping, their movements becoming more frantic. The smaller one's checking glances were almost continuous now, its eyes wide with a fear that seemed to go beyond simple animal distress. They were close to something. James could feel it in their changing behavior, in the way they pushed through their exhaustion with renewed determination. A sound carried through the trees, faint but distinct, a low moaning that made James's heart race. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't machinery. It was something alive, something in pain. The cubs reacted immediately to the sound, their cries changing to match it. They were calling back to something, or someone. The mystery of their mother's absence suddenly felt much closer to being solved. But the sounds raised more questions than answers. What kind of situation could separate a mother bear from her cubs? What could be so dire that the cubs would risk approaching a human for help? The answer lay ahead, through the thinning trees, where the cubs were leading him with such singular purpose. Their path ended at the base of a steep, rocky slope. Old mining equipment littered the area, half hidden under years of forest growth. The moaning was louder here, echoing strangely as if coming from below ground. The cub's behavior reached a new level of intensity. The smaller one paced back and forth, while the injured cub slumped against a rock, its strength finally failing. James scanned the area, his military training highlighting potential dangers. The ground here was treacherous, with hidden drops and unstable surfaces. The remnants of mining operations made it even more hazardous. Rusted equipment could give way at any moment, and old support structures might collapse under the slightest weight. The cub's whimpers drew his attention to a specific spot, where fallen rocks and old timbers created a chaotic jumble against the slope. The moaning seemed to originate from somewhere beneath this debris. As James carefully approached, the cub's behavior confirmed his suspicion. They had brought him exactly where they needed him to be. Their mother was here, somewhere below the surface, and from the sounds of her cries, she was badly hurt. The moaning grew louder as James carefully approached the jumble of rocks and timber. His flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing a dark opening partially hidden by fallen debris. The cubs pressed close to his legs, their earlier fear completely replaced by desperate need. The smaller one pawed at his boot, then moved toward the opening, looking back with unmistakable meaning. James played his light over the ground, noting disturbed earth and fresh claw marks around the hole. Recent activity, probably within the last few days. The opening was part of an old mine shaft, its original timber supports rotting and dangerous. But something about the debris looked wrong. This wasn't just natural decay. There had been a recent collapse. A louder moan echoed from below, followed by a weak growl. The cubs responded immediately, their cries taking on a different tone. They were communicating with their mother, letting her know help had arrived. James knelt by the opening, shining his light into the darkness. What he saw made his breath catch. 15 feet below, trapped in the narrow confines of the old mine shaft, lay an adult black bear. The collapse had created a natural funnel, sending her tumbling into the shaft, but preventing her from falling all the way to the bottom. She was wedged at an awkward angle, held in place by fallen timbers and rocks. Her labored breathing echoed in the confined space. The bear's eyes reflected his flashlight beam, showing awareness but not aggression. Like her cubs, she seemed to understand that James represented help rather than threat. Blood matted her fur in several places, and her position suggested possible broken bones. The situation suddenly became clear. She had been trapped here for days, unable to climb out, while her cubs remained loyally above ground. What happened next astonished James even more than the cubs' earlier behavior. As he assessed the situation, the mother bear remained calm, watching him with an intelligence that matched her cubs. Despite her pain and fear, despite every natural instinct to fight or flee from human presence, she stayed still. She understood. James pulled back from the opening, his mind racing through options. The shaft was too unstable for him to climb down safely. The mother bear's injuries looked serious, and any wrong movement could send her plummeting deeper into the mine. He needed help, professional help, but that would take time. Time the bear might not have. He reached for his satellite phone, but hesitated. The cubs pressed against him again, their small bodies trembling with exhaustion and worry. They had done the impossible, breaking every rule of nature to find help for their mother. Now they were trusting him to make the right decision. The complexity of the situation hit him full force. This wasn't just about a trapped animal. This was about a family fighting for survival against impossible odds. The cubs had watched their mother fall, had stayed with her for days, had somehow known their only hope was to trust a human. Their intelligence and devotion went beyond anything James had encountered in his years of wilderness experience. He began documenting the scene with his phone's camera, knowing he would need to convince others of the situation's urgency. The shaft's opening, the bear's position, the fresh collapse that had trapped her. Each detail would be crucial for the rescue team. The mother bear watched his movements, her eyes following the flash of his camera with remarkable calmness. The cub's behavior had changed again. The smaller one had settled next to its injured sibling, both of them watching James with complete focus. They were waiting, trusting him to take the next step. Their earlier urgency had been replaced by a patient certainty that help had arrived. James made a careful initial assessment of the rescue requirements. The shaft's instability was the biggest immediate concern. Any rescue attempt would need proper equipment and expertise. But first, he needed to ensure the mother bear's condition remained stable. He pulled his emergency medical kit from his backpack, knowing he might need to provide some immediate aid before the rescue team arrived. The mother bear's breathing had become more labored and her movements more restricted. The weight of the debris was clearly taking its toll. Time was running out. James could see signs of dehydration, and her injuries needed immediate attention. The cubs sensed the urgency too, their whimpers growing more distressed as their mother's condition deteriorated. Taking a deep breath, James activated his satellite phone. This would require a coordinated effort between military rescue teams and wildlife services. As he waited for the connection, he looked at the family of bears. The cubs huddled together, watching him with unwavering trust. Their mother, despite her pain, maintained that same calm awareness. They had done everything they could. Now it was his turn to prove their trust in humans had not been misplaced. The response to James's emergency call was swift and decisive. Within minutes, his satellite phone connected him to Fort Carson's Emergency Response Center. As he explained the situation, even the seasoned dispatcher fell silent for a moment, taking in the extraordinary nature of the rescue needed. "We need wildlife services, rescue equipment, and a veterinary team," James detailed, keeping his voice steady and professional despite the urgency of the situation. "The shaft is unstable. We will need mining expertise too." He could hear the dispatcher coordinating multiple calls, setting in motion a rescue operation unlike anything they had handled before. While waiting for help to arrive, James focused on keeping the cubs calm. Their mother's breathing had grown more labored, and they sensed her distress. He pulled emergency water packets from his kit, carefully opening one and creating a small pool on a flat rock. The cubs, despite their exhaustion, waited for his encouraging nod before drinking. Their trust in him had become absolute. The sound of approaching helicopters broke the forest silence. The cubs startled, pressing closer to James as the noise grew louder. He spoke to them softly, steadily, knowing his calm would help them endure the chaos about to descend on their small clearing. The mother bear below remained remarkably still, as if understanding that the increasing noise meant help was coming. The rescue teams arrived in waves. First, a military helicopter touched down in a nearby clearing, bringing the initial response team. Wildlife services arrived minutes later by ground, their vehicles navigating the rough terrain with practiced skill. Each new arrival paused briefly, taken aback by the sight of two bear cubs, calmly sitting beside a Special Forces sergeant. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the lead wildlife veterinarian, approached first. Her expression showed both professional concern and amazement at the scene before her. "In 20 years of wildlife rescue, I have never seen anything like this," she said, kneeling to examine the cubs from a respectful distance. "They really led you here?" James nodded, explaining the morning's events as the rescue teams set up equipment around them. The cubs stayed close, watching the activity with nervous attention, but never leaving his side. Their trust in him seemed to extend to the rescue team as long as he remained near. The mine rescue specialists arrived next, bringing specialized equipment and expertise. Their initial assessment of the shaft confirmed James's fears. The structure was dangerously unstable. Any rescue attempt would need to be swift and precise. One wrong move could bring the entire shaft down. "We need to secure the opening first," the lead rescue engineer explained, directing his team to set up stabilizing equipment. "Then we can create a pulley system to lift her out. But she will need to be sedated. Any struggling could collapse the shaft." Dr. Martinez prepared the tranquilizer dart with careful precision. The mother bear would need to be calm for the rescue, but too much sedation could be dangerous in her weakened condition. The cubs whimpered as she approached the shaft opening, sensing the critical moment had arrived. James stayed with the cubs as the veterinarian took her position. The mother bear watched the activity above her with remarkable calmness, as if understanding each step of her rescue. When the dart found its mark, she barely reacted, her eyes staying focused on her cubs until the sedation took effect. The rescue operation moved with careful urgency. Support beams were inserted to stabilize the shaft walls. A pulley system was anchored to several large trees, tested and retested to ensure it could bear the weight. Throughout the preparations, James kept the cubs engaged, distracting them from their mother's unconscious state with water and gentle attention. The most dangerous part of the rescue came as the teams prepared to lift the mother bear. The cubs sensed the tension in the air, pressing closer to James as the pulley system creaked into motion. The rescue team worked with practiced efficiency, but every movement was a risk. Loose rocks clattered down the shaft, each sound making the cubs flinch. The mother bear's unconscious form slowly emerged from the darkness, carefully supported by straps and guide wires. The cubs stood on their hind legs, watching intently as their mother was finally brought into the sunlight. The rescue team quickly moved her to a prepared examination area where Dr. Martinez began immediate treatment. James led the cubs to a safe distance where they could see their mother but not interfere with the medical care. The larger cub's injured paw had begun bleeding again from the stress of the day. A wildlife medic approached cautiously, and to everyone's amazement, the cub allowed its wound to be cleaned and bandaged, never taking its eyes off its mother's form. The clearing had become a hub of focused activity. Medical equipment beeped steadily, monitoring the mother bear's vital signs. Rescue teams carefully dismantled their equipment, while wildlife experts prepared for the family's transportation to a rehabilitation facility. Through it all, the cubs remained calm, drawing strength from James's continued presence. The mother bear's condition stabilized under Dr. Martinez's expert care. Her injuries, though serious, were treatable. Multiple fractures, severe dehydration, and extensive bruising told the story of her days trapped in the shaft. But her strength, like that of her cubs, proved remarkable. The wildlife medical team worked through the afternoon, providing fluids, setting bones, and treating her wounds. As the sun began to set, the family was carefully transported to Colorado's largest wildlife rehabilitation center. The cubs, exhausted but unwilling to leave their mother's side, were placed in the same transport cage. Before they left, both cubs turned to look at James one final time. Their eyes held the same intelligence that had first drawn him to help them, now mixed with something that looked remarkably like gratitude. In the weeks that followed, James found himself making regular visits to the rehabilitation center. Dr. Martinez welcomed his presence, noting how the cubs remained calmer during treatments when he was nearby. The mother bear, too, seemed to remember him, watching him with that same steady gaze that had marked their first encounter in the mine shaft. Their recovery is nothing short of miraculous, Dr. Martinez told him during one visit, as they watched the family through the observation window. The mother bear's fractures were healing well, and she had regained much of her strength. The cubs stayed close to her, but their playful nature had returned. The larger cub's paw had healed completely, leaving only a small scar as a reminder of their extraordinary journey. The cubs' behavior continued to fascinate the rehabilitation staff. They showed remarkable intelligence in their interactions, using problem-solving skills that seemed advanced for their age. Yet they remained wild animals, their natural instincts strong despite their unusual experience with humans. It was a delicate balance, one that would prove crucial for their eventual return to the wild. James's training schedule allowed him to visit every few weeks. Each time, he noticed small changes in the family. The mother bear grew stronger, more active. The cubs developed the skills they would need for survival, learning from their mother while maintaining that special awareness that had saved her life. Their story spread through the military base and beyond, drawing attention from wildlife experts interested in studying the remarkable bond between the bears and their unlikely rescuer. As spring turned to summer, the time approached for the family's release. The rehabilitation team had chosen a remote area deep in the national forest, far from human activity, but rich in natural resources. James was invited to attend the release, a privilege he accepted with mixed emotions. He knew this was the right ending to their story, but part of him would miss these extraordinary animals. The morning of the release brought perfect weather. The family was transported in separate carriers to protect both them and the handlers. At the release site, the carriers were carefully positioned to allow the bears to exit toward the forest. James stood at a safe distance, watching as the doors were opened. The mother bear emerged first, her movements strong and confident. Her injuries had healed completely, leaving her ready to return to her natural life. She paused at the carrier's entrance, testing the air and surveying her surroundings. The cubs followed, their movements showing none of the desperation that had marked their first meeting with James. The family moved a short distance from the carriers, staying close together as they explored their new territory. Then, in a moment that the witnesses would never forget, All three bears turned to look back. Their gaze found James, and for a brief moment, that connection that had defied natural laws was renewed. The mother bear nodded slightly, an almost human gesture that left the observers speechless. Then she turned, leading her cubs into the forest that would once again be their home. James stood watching long after the bears had disappeared into the undergrowth. His experience with them had changed something fundamental in his understanding of the natural world. The intelligence they had shown, the trust they had placed in him, challenged everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. In the years that followed, James would continue his work at Fort Carson, training soldiers in wilderness survival. But his teachings now included a new element. He shared the story of the bear cubs, not just as an extraordinary rescue, but as a lesson in the unexpected connections that can form when desperation meets compassion, when natural instincts give way to higher understanding. Wildlife cameras would occasionally capture images of the family, thriving in their natural habitat. The cubs grew into strong, young bears, their unique early experience leaving no apparent impact on their ability to live wild and free. But their story lived on, a reminder that in moments of greatest need, the barriers between species can dissolve, leaving only the pure and simple reality of one being helping another. If this incredible tale of courage, trust, and unexpected bonds between humans and wildlife moved you, there's more where this came from. Subscribe to our channel, Legacy Stories, for daily stories of remarkable animal rescues, heartwarming moments in nature, and extraordinary bonds that challenge our understanding of the wild. Click that subscribe button now and join our growing community of wildlife enthusiasts. Never miss another inspiring story of survival, compassion, and the amazing connections that can form between humans and animals when nature writes its own rules.